A silence before the storm. Europe in the middle of the 14th century was a continent of deep contrasts, as if history itself breathed through the damp stones of its streets and the thick walls of its fortresses. The bells of the churches marked the rhythm of the days, with a sound that seemed eternal, as if nothing could interrupt that echo which, for generations, had ordered the life of cities and countryside alike. Villagers sowed wheat at dawn, merchants opened their stalls in the cobbled markets, and children ran through narrow alleys, unaware that all of it, every daily gesture, every habit, and every certainty, hung by a thread thinner than anyone could imagine. The European population was growing after centuries of war, famine, and heavy superstitions. Trade was slowly reawakening. Kingdoms were becoming more efficient, and some cities even began to resemble the first glimmers of an emerging bourgeoisie. Florence, Paris, and London were vibrant cities, full of artisans, pilgrims, clergy, prostitutes, doctors, and thieves, all mingling in a single human melody, a chorus of different voices that coexisted, argued, prayed, bargained, and survived. In the countryside, serfs worked lands that were not their own since the moment they could walk, and though the weight of feudalism pressed down on their backs, many felt that life followed an acceptable course. Not perfect, but stable. Not glorious, but understandable. The air of that time was full of rituals meant to tame the invisible. Prayers for good harvests, candles lit to avoid tragic births, stars consulted before making important decisions. Diseases existed, of course, as part of the natural landscape, something that came and went, like the seasons. Leprosy and smallpox, fevers and chills were known enemies. Some succumbed, others survived. It was the price of living in a world where God, the devil, and fate formed a fearsome and inevitable trinity. But none of that resembled, not even remotely, what was about to come. The reality they knew was merely a prologue, a quiet introduction before the great collapse. No one knew it yet, but the clock had already begun to tick. Far from there, beyond the boundaries Europeans could even imagine, something stirred in the wild heart of the Asian continent, in regions that for them were no more than names whispered by merchants and adventurers. There, in those vast lands, lived an enemy that did not roar or bare its fangs. It was small, invisible to the eye, but capable of bringing empires to their knees. In the plains of Central Asia, where caravans moved like veins of dust across the landscape, the ancient balance between humans, animals, and nature was beginning to break. Marmots, silent carriers of an ancient poison, were hunted for their fur, and in handling them, traders came into contact with something that had slept in the guts of those animals since time immemorial. Fleas, tiny travelers aboard rodents, acted as unconscious intermediaries, transferring a lethal bacterium that would soon find a route westward. There was no specific day when it all began. There is no exact date, no identifiable spark. History does not always offer clocks, but it does offer signs. In the years leading up to the Great Plague, certain phenomena occurred that many considered insignificant. Minor outbreaks in Asian villages, caravans that never returned, rumors among merchants speaking of a strange fever, of sudden death and blackened bodies. They were just scattered words, bits of stories, fragments that did not worry those living thousands of kilometers away, protected, they believed, by mountains, seas, and walls. The world at the time was immense and slow. News took months to cross continents. Epidemics, on the other hand, did not need words to spread. They only needed a body, a bite, a journey. And that, precisely, was what was happening while Europe breathed in apparent peace. In European cities, public squares were still filled with heralds and political arguments. Festivals celebrated the harvests, nobles arranged marriage alliances, and the church maintained its moral and spiritual dominance over a population that, although sometimes doubtful, did not dare to break the silence imposed by centuries of tradition. No one imagined that, in a few years, those same squares would be empty, the heralds dead, the corpses piled at the doors of temples, and that faith, that unquestionable pillar, would be dragged by the current of suffering into darker questions. Ships still crossed the Mediterranean, loaded with spices, fabrics, metals, slaves, books, and oriental curiosities. The Silk Road kept the pulse between East and West alive, an exchange that not only brought products, but also ideas, languages, customs, and this time, unknowingly, something much more sinister. Trade, that symbol of human progress, would be the perfect channel for the enemy that was approaching. In the fortresses, nobles spoke of bloodlines and battles, unaware that their coats of arms would offer no shield against disease. In the monasteries, monks copied manuscripts and chanted psalms, not knowing that soon they would have to bury their brothers without performing the proper rites, because there would be no time, no space, no comfort. The calm of that era was the calm of a sleeping beast, breathing deeply before opening its eyes. Europe was alive, yes, but it was a life unaware of its own fragility. Like a grand cathedral, beautiful and well-built, but raised over a crack that no one had noticed, and the crack would soon begin to widen. There were those who, in the stillest nights, sensed that something was changing. Perhaps it was the weather, more erratic. Perhaps the skies, tinged with strange colors. Perhaps it was the visions of marginal prophets, who spoke in plazas with feverish eyes, announcing punishments, purifications, imminent judgment. But such men were ignored, or stoned, or locked away in the towers of the insane. Europe believed itself safe. Europe believed it had time. But time was already poisoned. It was already traveling in caravans, already hiding in ship holds, already sleeping beneath the nails of rats. And while poets sang of love, carpenters built new mills, and children learned to read psalms in Latin, something dark and silent was drawing closer. It did not run. It did not fly. It made no noise. But it advanced, with the patience of the inevitable. Soon, a single cough would be enough to condemn an entire family. An invisible bite would be enough to empty a village. Soon, days would be filled with smoke, funeral bells, and muffled cries. But not yet. Not in this moment of history. There was still bread on the table, still dancing in the squares. The storm was approaching, but the sky remained blue, for just a little longer. And so, Europe breathes one last time with innocence, unaware that it is standing at the edge of the abyss. Because while men looked to the sky for signs, death had already begun its journey from the east. And it would not stop until everything had changed. Now the first thread of that mortal shadow tightens in Crimea, where a besieged city will mark the true beginning of the end. The flame in the Far East. In the vast territories of Central Asia, where the mountains blend with the horizon and the winds sweep across the steppes with almost ritual constancy, the beginning of a tragedy began to take shape. One that would cross continents without anyone being able to stop it. It was there, in the least mapped regions of the European imagination, that death began its rise. Silent, stealthy, like an ember that burns unnoticed, until it sets fire to everything around it. Those regions were inhabited by nomadic tribes, itinerant merchants, and a variety of wild animals that, in their daily interaction with humans, shared more than just the landscape. Among them, wild marmots, sturdy creatures with thick fur and nervous eyes, carried within them a deadly guest. Inside their bodies lived a bacterium that for centuries had coexisted with nature, provoking no more than sporadic outbreaks in small, isolated settlements. But the dynamics of the world were changing. trade had woven an invisible web connecting the heart of Asia to the urban centers of Western Europe. What had once been isolated now began to circulate. The movement of caravans along the Silk Road increased year after year, transporting jade, silk, spices, porcelain, and along with all that, unwanted passengers. The danger did not come from the merchants or the pack animals, but from the fleas that lived among the traded furs. Tiny and seemingly harmless fleas that carried within them the bacterium Yersinia pestis, a microscopic killer that had learned to travel from body to body, from rodent to human, and from there to everything else. Marmots were hunted for their pelts, highly valued in the markets, and in that process, humans were exposed to the fluids, the bites, and the parasites that detached when the animal died. Each contact opened the door to the inevitable. The first major outbreak with characteristics similar to what would later be known as the Black Death was documented in the year 1338 in the regions that today form part of Western Mongolia and the Gobi Desert. Some Chinese chronicles mention a devastating plague that wiped out entire populations within weeks. The symptoms described are disturbingly familiar: high fever, vomiting of blood, buboes in the groin and armpits, sudden death. However, at that time, the world still did not grasp the magnitude of the enemy. Information was easily diluted, mixed with superstition, lost in the folds of time. As the plague moved westward, it used the trade routes with the efficiency of a well-trained army. It climbed onto carts traveling the dusty roads of Asia. It hid in sacks of grain, in bundles of fabric, in the dark corners of yurts. It passed through Samarkand, crossed Bukhara, reached the gates of Persia, and touched the shores of the Caspian Sea. Wherever it went, it left behind a trail of bodies no one knew how to bury, and questions no wise man could answer. Meanwhile, the Mongol Empire, at its territorial peak, offered the paradox of unifying lands and peoples that had never before been so connected. That vast network of dominions facilitated trade, yes, but also contagion. The same routes that enabled the swift movement of goods allowed the plague to spread like an oil stain across fabric. The Pax Mongolica, that order imposed with an iron hand, proved to be the perfect framework for disaster. In key cities like Kashgar, Tabriz, or Baghdad, the markets teemed with activity. Merchants from all over Eurasia gathered to exchange goods, stories, and coins from places so distant they seemed invented. It was in those encounters that the plague found its opportunities. A sneeze in a caravan, a flea leaping from a sack to a tunic, a body that begins to tremble while the convoy is still moving. No one notices at first, because the plague does not strike immediately. It settles, it waits, then it attacks. And when it does, there is no escape. People fall ill within days, sometimes within hours. The buboes, those grotesque swellings that erupt from the body as if the skin itself were trying to expel the evil, become signs of doom. Families splinter as soon as someone coughs. Fear becomes routine, and routine becomes resignation. The cycle begins: sickness, isolation, death. Traditional rituals, unable to confront the plague, are abandoned. Religion transforms into desperate pleading. People begin to speak of divine punishment, of demons, of witchcraft. Logic fades as swiftly as life. The chronicles of the Yuan Empire and the Arab records of the period offer scattered clues about this advance. Some speak of sick winds, others of entire cities emptied within a month. Though the texts are steeped in metaphors and symbolism, the constant is always the same: a fast, inexplicable, and expansive death. In some places, the plague seems to subside. In others, it returns with force. No one understands its pattern. No one controls its path. On the way to Europe, one of the most critical turning points was the Black Sea, an essential crossroads between Asia and the Christian West. There lay the trading city of Caffa on the Crimean Peninsula, a stronghold controlled by Italian merchants, in constant friction with the Tartar peoples who also claimed power over the region. It was at that intersection of civilizations, political tensions, and trade routes that the plague found direct access to the heart of Europe. But that episode deserves its own chapter, because what happened in Caffa was not merely a military anecdote or a sanitary accident. It was a deliberate act of biological warfare, a grotesque prelude to the total disaster that was coming. For now, what matters is to understand that the plague did not arise as a curse fallen from the sky, nor as a spontaneous punishment. It formed over time, in a context where human contact, territorial expansion, lack of medical knowledge, and unbridled trade created a perfect storm. It was not a sudden apparition, but a process that lit its flame in the forgotten corners of the world, then fed it with every kilometer traveled, every village touched, every body infected. And so, while Europe still slept beneath the echo of its bells and the rhythm of its harvests, death moved forward, without official announcement, without a flag, without armies. It only needed bodies to carry it a little farther. It only needed time. And that time was running out. In Crimea, by the sea, a besieged city prepares to resist, without realizing that the true enemy is not outside its walls, but already breathing within. The Siege of Caffa, War and Contagion. On the shores of the Black Sea, where the wind carried the distant echoes of faraway caravans and the constant murmur of trade, stood the city of Caffa, a strategic jewel coveted by all who understood the value of controlling the routes between east and west. Founded by the Genoese and nestled in the Crimean Peninsula, this city was not merely a prosperous port or just another trading colony. It was a vital crossroads between civilizations, a meeting point where languages, goods, beliefs, and tensions blended beneath a thin veneer of stability. But in the year 1346, Caffa would go from being a point on the map to becoming one of the most haunting and symbolic scenes of all medieval history. It all began as so many other tragedies do, with a border conflict that escalated beyond expectations. The Genoese, with their usual maritime pragmatism and diplomatic cunning, had managed to establish themselves there with the permission of the Mongols of the Golden Horde, who controlled vast regions of the Eurasian steppe. The agreement was delicate, as fragile as anything built on forced tolerance. For years, both parties traded without major incident, though with mutual distrust. But at some point in the 1340s, a dispute between Italian Christians and local Muslims escalated beyond what was tolerable, and what had been a minor clash turned into a declared war. The Mongols, led by Khan Janibeg, responded with the force that had made them one of the most feared powers on the continent. They gathered a large army and surrounded Caffa with the intention of taking the city by force. What followed was a siege lasting months, even years, during which hunger, violence, and fear became the daily bread of everyone within the city walls. However, no army, no matter how large or fierce, can foresee every element that might turn against it. And in this case, the deadliest threat came not from the walls, nor the sea, but from within the Mongol camp itself. As the seasons passed, a disease began to spread among the Tatar troops. At first, it was thought to be a minor outbreak, a passing fever, something inevitable in a camp where thousands of men lived in precarious conditions. But soon the symptoms became strange, terrifying. Men who appeared healthy in the morning would die by nightfall, covered in blackened buboes, with dark blood flowing from their noses and mouths. The bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. And the most disturbing part was the way the disease seemed to multiply, jumping from soldier to soldier with no apparent logic. For the Genoese trapped inside the city, the plague consuming the enemy army must have seemed at first like some kind of unexpected miracle, a divine intervention that might put an end to the siege. But that naive perception would not last long, because what happened next transformed the war into something bordering on the macabre, something almost unimaginable. Realizing that his campaign was doomed by the outbreak, Khan Janibeg, or someone under his command, made a decision that would mark human history with a dark, indelible stain. He ordered the infected corpses to be hurled over Caffa's walls using catapults. What had once been a conventional military strategy turned into a primitive yet effective form of biological warfare. The dead flew through the air, bursting open as they landed in courtyards, plazas, or rooftops, spreading the plague inside a city that still did not fully understand what was happening. It was a desperate act, but also a calculated one. If they could not take Caffa by force, then the disease might do the job for them. Imagining the psychological impact of that rain of corpses is chilling. The citizens were not just besieged by a visible enemy, but also by one without shape or face, slipping through the air, contaminating food, clothing, and blood. People began to fall ill. Some tried to resist, sealing doors, covering wells, praying with increasing desperation. Others, seeing the city turn into an open-air cemetery, sought the only possible escape: the sea. Dozens of ships set sail from Caffa during those crucial weeks. Some carried grain in their holds, others bore slaves, jewels, or diplomatic documents. But all of them, without exception, carried something far more valuable and deadly: infected fleas, rats hiding among the crates, sailors already showing early signs of fever. They did not know it, but by fleeing the doomed city, they were sowing the chaos to come. One of those ships, likely among the first to leave, headed for Constantinople. Others made for the Italian ports of Genoa and Messina. Some believed that by physically distancing themselves from the epicenter of the disaster, they would be safe. The logic of the time was simple. What was far away could not reach you. But the plague did not respect that logic. It moved with monstrous efficiency. A single bite, a single infected sailor, was enough for the cycle to begin anew. This time in territories whose populations had neither the preparation nor the knowledge to face what was coming. Caffa was left behind, partially empty, partially dead. The chronicles of the time, few and fragmented, barely managed to convey the magnitude of what happened there. The siege, which had begun as a commercial and political conflict, ended as a gateway to hell. None of those involved could have imagined that what began as a military strategy would change the course of European history. The Genoese who survived the siege did not know they had just become the unintentional messengers of death. The decisions made during those days marked the precise moment when the continent's fate turned toward the abyss. It was not a divine punishment. It was not a sign from the heavens. It was the direct result of an interconnected trade network, of human decisions made under pressure, of a biological enemy that had learned to use our own structures against us. The plague was no longer on the margins of the world. It was no longer a distant problem, contained in strange lands. It had already crossed the sea. And as the sails of the Genoese ships disappeared on the horizon, the silence in the besieged city could only mean one thing: the contagion had begun its journey. In the distance, the coasts of Sicily were preparing to receive ships that did not carry goods, but the first wave of death. The next chapter, inevitable, would be written in blood, in the heart of Europe. The plague takes the sea. The winds of the Black Sea blew with a deceptive calm when the first ships departed from Caffa, leaving behind the acrid stench of death that filled the streets, the walls, and the souls. On board the ships were men exhausted by the siege, desperate merchants, sick sailors, chained slaves, and in the least visible corners, between ropes, fabrics, and barrels, hid a silent and lethal presence. Small fleas carrying the seed of a cataclysm. That was the moment when the plague, until then confined to dry land, took the sea as a natural extension of its advance. It was not a sudden leap. There were no announcements in the sky or supernatural signs. But in every ship that left the coast of Crimea traveled a fragment of disaster, an echo still contained of the darkness that would soon erupt violently on the shores of the Mediterranean. Unlike armies, which move according to campaigns with defined strategies and targets, the plague slipped into commercial routes, nestled into the folds of human trade, and became part of the nautical landscape without anyone noticing. The Genoese ships, accustomed to moving between ports like pieces in a well-mastered game, unknowingly became instruments of contagion. While the captain negotiated routes, the navigator traced stars, and the cook boiled legumes in a rusty pot. A rat descended a rope. A flea leapt from a bundle onto a leg. A fever began to burn inside the body of a young deckhand. Thus began the invisible dance. The disease needed no words or agreements, only an opportunity. Navigation in the 14th century was not a fast process. Each journey from port to port involved days of uncertainty, sleepless nights, storms that arrived without warning, flat calms that halted progress, and forced the rationing of water and stale bread. Meanwhile, in the hold, rodents nested, multiplied, and walked among the provisions. The fleas, small and persistent, bit those sleeping close to the floor, and once the first sailor was infected, the rest of the crew was already doomed. The plague found in ships the ideal conditions: heat, overcrowding, poor hygiene, and constant movement. It was, essentially, the perfect breeding ground for its spread. And the cruelest part was that upon arrival in port, it was not even necessary to unload the cargo for the damage to begin. It was enough for one sick man to step ashore in search of food, for one rat to crawl out of the hull in the middle of the night, for one flea to travel in a sack of wheat. Contagion began long before anyone could suspect it. One of the first destinations was Constantinople. The Byzantine capital, vibrant and decaying at the same time, received the disease as one receives an enemy disguised as an ally. There, amid the bustle of bazaars, liturgical chants, and imperial intrigues, the first cases went unnoticed. A merchant dying in his bed, a child with inexplicable fever, a woman with swollen buboes on her neck. No one connected these symptoms with the rumors coming from the east. The world still did not speak with a single voice, and news became distorted with every passing mile. From Constantinople, other ships departed toward the south and west. One touched the shores of Rhodes, another stopped in Alexandria, another continued toward the Adriatic. But it was in Sicily that the plague struck its most resounding blow. October of 1347. The port of Messina, used to receiving ships from all over, suddenly encountered a sinister fleet. The ships that docked arrived with sagging sails, silent decks, and bodies piled in the holds. The few sailors still breathing were covered in sores, their eyes sunken, delirious between prayers and screams. They did not know where they were. They did not know what they carried within. The people of Messina reacted in horror. Chroniclers of the time describe scenes in which authorities ordered the ships to be expelled, where they attempted to close the port, where they burned the crew's clothing in bonfires outside the city. But it was all in vain. The plague had already come ashore. It was already walking the streets, slipping through windows, clinging to coins and loaves of bread. Human decisions, decrees, and pleas came too late. By the time they were made, the evil had already infiltrated daily life. From Messina, the disease quickly spread to other areas of Sicily, reaching Palermo and then Catania. Trying to stop its advance was like trying to catch smoke with one's hands. Each ship that tried to flee became a new burning spark, and the entire sea turned into a web spun by chance and panic. The Mediterranean, once a symbol of meeting and trade, became a floating cemetery. The maritime routes that connected the great centers of power, Genoa, Pisa, Venice, Marseille, Barcelona, were now corridors of death. Some ports blocked the entry of suspicious ships. Others tried to impose quarantines, though the concept was barely an intuition. In Ragusa, a city in what is now Croatia, one of the first organized ideas of isolation emerged. It was ordered that ships remain anchored for 40 days before disembarking. It was the seed of what centuries later would be known as quarantine. But at that time, while the plague continued claiming lives at a ferocious pace, these measures were late and, above all, ineffective. The sea was taken. Merchants hesitated between fleeing and selling information. Some took advantage of the chaos to profit. Others simply vanished without a trace, swallowed by the water, the plague, or fear. Desperation became the norm. No one was trusted anymore. Sailors were suspected, foreigners were feared, even papal messengers were viewed with suspicion. Every ship that appeared on the horizon was received with a mixture of terror and resignation. The port cities, once ruled by the bustle of commerce, the scent of spices, and the songs of dock workers, transformed into ghost towns. Church bells tolled without pause. Doctors died before they could understand what they were facing. Ships, which for centuries had carried riches, knowledge, letters, and desires, were now heralds of decomposition. And meanwhile, in the interior of Europe, the plague had not yet arrived. The mountains, the fields, and the castles still did not know what was coming. But the rats had already jumped ashore, and every open port was a new wound. The sea was no longer a boundary, it had become a highway for disaster. The plague took the sea as if it had been waiting for it all along, as if its true calling had always been to sail, to ride the waves, to slip through the cracks of ships and burst without ceremony into every corner of civilization. Now that Sicily had fallen, the next heartbeat of disaster was preparing on the Italian mainland. The entire peninsula, divided among proud republics and opulent cities, was about to witness human fragility in its rawest form. And it had all begun with a simple crossing of waters, with one sick ship and a port that welcomed it, unaware of what it carried on board. Messina, the first dagger to Europe. In October of the year 1347, the port of Messina, in the northeast of the island of Sicily, continued to operate with the same normality it had known for generations. The shipyards vibrated with the hammering of carpenters, dock workers moved among barrels and bundles, and merchants shouted prices among taut sails and the intertwined aromas of the sea and spices. It was a day like any other, or so it seemed. But beyond the horizon, from the mists of the Black Sea, a Genoese fleet approached with the solemnity of a funeral procession. And when their masts appeared on the bay's outline, European history, until then slow and predictable, began to tear at its deepest seam. The ships came from Caffa, crossing waters that already carried the disease in their silence. On board, there were no lively crews or cargo ready for trade. What they brought was an invisible and deadly burden. Most of the sailors had died at sea, and the few who still clung to life were nothing more than shadows of themselves. Sweaty skin, bodies shaken by fever, dull eyes staring without understanding. And although some tried to warn of what was happening to them, no one on land was prepared to interpret that desperate message. The vessels were received as an oddity, a disturbing vision that defied the usual logic of commerce. At first, the people of Messina did not know what to do with those ships. Some were towed to the dock with long grappling hooks, while others were left adrift, as if their very presence caused repulsion. Rumors spread faster than the rats. People spoke of an Eastern curse, of divine punishment, of an outbreak born from the infidelity of crusaders or the sins of greedy merchants. These explanations, although absurd, were easier to accept than the idea of a faceless evil that killed without reason. The plague slid from the ships to the docks, and from there into the cobbled streets and wooden houses, like a stain that could not be stopped by prayers or walls. The first cases appeared among dock workers and boys who wandered around the harbor. A young fisherman's assistant, who had gone to investigate one of the ships, was found 2 days later with his skin marked by strange dark spots and a heat that consumed him from within. Then it was a merchant's son, who collapsed during breakfast, and soon after, a monk from the nearby monastery. Every time someone fell ill, others watched in horror as their lymph nodes swelled, their skin darkened, and a dense odor began to emanate even before their breath stopped. The pattern was so rapid and devastating that any attempt at medical care or even understanding became useless. What they were witnessing was not a common disease. It was something different, inhuman, something seemingly designed to destroy with almost surgical efficiency. Within days, panic replaced disbelief. Families shut their doors, sealed windows, hung religious amulets, and burned incense without rest. Priests walked through the streets with crosses, psalms, and holy water, trying to calm the faithful, although many of them had already begun to cough blood and tremble while holding the chalice. Authorities tried to impose some order, but their decrees were as fragile as the bodies of the infected. Some proposed abandoning the city, others demanded that the most affected neighborhoods be burned, and some, in their desperation, offered animal sacrifices in the public square, hoping to appease what they believed was a heavenly punishment. But the evil had already taken root. Messina became a nest of corpses. Every street, every square, every corner where there had once been music and trade, turned into a grotesque scene of simultaneous agony. The carts that once carried goods now transported bodies. The bells, which once marked the hours of the day, rang almost exclusively to announce deaths. Time was no longer measured in hours or days. It was counted in burials. And even so, in the midst of that chaos, there were those who decided to flee. Some residents, convinced that the plague was a local phenomenon, set sail for the south of Italy, for Calabria, for Naples, for any place where the sky still seemed clean. Others fled on impulse without knowing where they were going, as if movement itself were an act of faith. Each of those fugitives, each ship that departed with infected people, drove the dagger even deeper into the body of Europe. Every town where they stopped, every inn where they sought refuge, every city that received them without knowing their origin, was like opening another wound on a map that would soon be covered in mourning. Messina was trapped in a kind of limbo, neither completely dead nor still alive. Those who remained lived for weeks immersed in a routine of fear, confinement, and whispers. The song of birds disappeared. Masterless dogs wandered among the bodies. Children stopped crying. It was as if time had decided to stand still and silently contemplate the magnitude of human pain. A pain without meaning, without redemption, without comfort. And while the city died, Europe still did not fully grasp what was approaching. In Florence, banquets were still being held. In Paris, philosophers debated morality. In London, the bourgeoisie discussed the price of wheat. No one saw that what had begun in Messina was merely the beginning of something larger, much larger. Because the plague, now free from the limits of the sea, spread as if the world belonged to it. From the ruins of Messina, the disease traced its own paths. It did not respect main roads, nor did it stop before castles. It crossed mountains, valleys, rivers, borders, and walls. And as it did, every corner of Europe began to hear, with an ever closer echo, the bells that once rang in Sicily. Soon, those bells would toll in Genoa, then in Florence, then in Paris. The plague did not travel through maps. It traveled through fear, and there was no turning back. Fire in the Peninsula. The plague did not descend upon Italy as a single, sudden wave, but rather as a series of tongues of fire that ignited one after another, devouring everything in their path with an insatiable hunger. What had begun as an outbreak in the port city of Messina became a succession of invisible wildfires that swept across the Italian peninsula with the speed of a curse. From the first swollen corpse to fall on Sicilian soil, the disease began charting its own map. ignoring logical roots and disregarding political borders. Italy, land of merchants, bankers, princes, saints, artists, and soldiers, was about to burn from within. The first outbreaks erupted in the coastal cities, as if the sea, the same sea that had once brought wealth and glory to Genoa, Pisa, and Venice, now demanded payment in the form of plague. Genoa, one of the most powerful republics of the Mediterranean, received the first infected ships before it could even understand what had happened in Messina. And by the time it did, it was too late. The city, proud of its walls and its influence, found itself trapped in a spiral of death that neither gold-plated shields nor political alliances could stop. Accounts from the time all agree on one terrifying detail: the speed. The plague moved with a logic that defied all knowledge. Days, sometimes mere hours, were enough for a street to shift from bustling life to absolute silence. The sick collapsed in markets, in churches, at their own doorsteps. Some tried to flee, but in their desperation only carried the infection further, spreading it like embers leaping from a fire to ignite new blazes. Clothes were burned, windows sealed, laurel branches hung on doors, and prayers were recited like empty mantras. Nothing could halt its advance. It was like trying to smother a fire with a handful of ash. Florence, cradle of artists, bankers, and thinkers, was one of the first interior jewels to fall. The city, vibrant and complex, used to intrigue among powerful families and the bustle of guilds, was transformed within weeks into a stage of desolation. Boccaccio, a witness of those days, left a harrowing account in the prologue to the Decameron, describing how parents abandoned their children, how siblings fled from one another, how bodies were dumped into mass graves with no ceremony beyond a shove and a whispered blessing. The plague did not only kill the body, it dismantled the human bond. It unraveled the unspoken rules of coexistence, pushing each person to save themselves however they could. In Siena, a city that was then in the middle of an architectural golden age, the epidemic brought everything to a halt. Construction sites were abandoned, workshops shuttered, monks fell silent in their choirs. The grand cathedral, symbol of power and faith, remained unfinished, as if even stone had surrendered to fear. And something similar happened in every corner of the peninsula. Where once there had been planning, commerce, and intellectual life, now there was smoke, silence, and the constant sound of carts hauling away corpses. Each region, each city, had its own way of facing the plague. Some sealed their gates completely, trying to isolate themselves from the outside world, as if the evil could be trapped beyond their walls. Others sought solace in religious fanaticism, organizing penitential processions, public flagellations, endless prayers that often served only to gather crowds and speed the contagion. Makeshift medical treatises were written, stars were consulted, herbs applied, bloodletting and cupping practiced, vinegar and aromatic smoke used. Every attempt failed before it could even take root. The plague followed no known rules. It advanced as an autonomous force, faceless, voiceless, but with a devastating will. Doctors, few and overwhelmed, became tragic figures. They wore thick robes, wide-brimmed hats, and soon adopted a bird-beaked mask filled with aromatic substances, believing that foul air, miasma, was the vehicle of the disease. That figure, part science, part superstition, became the symbol of the era, a desperate attempt to impose order on the incomprehensible. Many died within days. Others simply vanished. Medicine, as it then existed, had no real tools to confront what was happening. Its theories, inherited from Galen and Hippocrates, had no place for a disease that traveled without logic and killed without distinction. In the midst of such chaos, all sorts of theories began to circulate. Some said the plague came from poisoned air, that the stars had altered their course, that wells were contaminated. that the Jews had conspired with alchemists to destroy Christians. Others blamed cats, witches, foreigners, or divine punishment for sins of the flesh. The need to find a culprit grew as the corpses piled up, because accepting that there was no explanation, that this was simply an unleashed force without reason, was more terrifying than any myth. In Rome, Pope Clement VI, taking refuge in Avignon, ordered mass prayers and granted indulgences to all who died without confession. In many churches, absolution was given collectively, without names or rites. Bells rang all day, and at night the streets were lit by flames as carts rolled again and again, collecting bodies no one claimed. Houses were abandoned without warning, and in villages where the sick outnumbered the healthy, doors were simply shut and the dying left to perish together, with no one daring to enter. And yet, even amid the disaster, there were those who profited. Unscrupulous doctors charged fortunes for worthless remedies. Dishonest merchants sold perfumed cloth at absurd prices. Landowners who died passed their properties to distant relatives, and many poor people suddenly inherited empty houses and parcels. In some cities, the most miserable neighborhoods were emptied, and their survivors occupied places they never would have dreamed of. The plague disrupted not only bodies but hierarchies. It was a brutal leveler, a chaos that swept away the social map. Italy was burning, not with visible flames, but with an inner combustion that consumed everything: economy, politics, culture, and faith. Cities that did not fall to disease collapsed under the weight of fear. And each new report arriving from a port or a valley confirmed what everyone already knew but dared not say aloud. There was no salvation. The roads that connected north and south, the caravan routes, the pilgrims' paths, all became veins in a sick body that spread infection with every beat. And while Italy writhed under the weight of its tragedy, the rest of Europe was only just beginning to sense that something terrible was heading their way. The plague would not stop in the peninsula. It had found its force, its rhythm, its momentum. The fire kept spreading, and the next spark was about to leap over the Alps. The Black Wind crosses the Alps. By the end of 1347 and the beginning of 1348, while the bells kept tolling in Florence, while bodies were being tossed into the nameless waters of Venice, and while rats multiplied beneath the stones of northern Italy, the Black Death was preparing to take one of its most decisive steps, crossing the Alps. Through mountain trails, trade routes, secret snowy valleys, the Black Wind moved with the sinister calm of the inevitable. The crossing was not as immediate as in the port cities, yet it was not slow either. The plague required no legions or banners. A group of merchants traveling up through the Valtellina or down through the Great St. Bernard Pass was enough. A mule dragging a cart laden with infected cloth, a sick beggar crossing the border unnoticed. This is how the disease found its way into the heart of the continent. And what was about to unfold, though it outwardly followed the course of an infection, was in truth the unfolding of a phenomenon that would tear through the psyche of all Europe. The first country to fall after the Alpine passage was Switzerland. Its scattered villages, nestled among mountains, might have seemed better protected than Italy's dense cities. Yet that apparent isolation provided no shield. On the contrary, the very trade routes that cut through the Swiss Alps to connect north and south became the perfect channels through which the plague slipped, silent and deadly. Lucerne, Basel, Zurich, names that today evoke order and cleanliness, became then scenes of chaos and decay. In Basel, authorities, unable to explain what was happening, began to look for scapegoats. The Jews were blamed, accused of poisoning wells, of conjuring evil through dark pacts or blasphemous rituals. And so, in a city already ravaged by senseless death, fear gave way to violence. In February 1349, hundreds of Jews were locked inside a wooden building outside the city and burned alive. The air, already fouled by the stench of illness, now carried the smoke of intolerance. The plague, indifferent to creed or ethnicity, continued to kill indiscriminately. As the disease descended through the Swiss valleys, it spread east and north. German cities began to receive the first signs of the disaster. In Augsburg, Munich, Nuremberg, news arrived before the plague itself, but only by days. Word of what was happening in Italy crossed the mountains with merchant caravans, but the message came blurred, like a distorted echo. Stories were told of a plague that blackened the skin, of corpses that burst open, of wild dogs devouring human remains, of infants born with marks from hell. The mix of superstition and reality made it nearly impossible to distinguish truth from rumor. But panic took root, even without confirmation. In the villages of Bavaria and the Upper Rhineland, the reaction was even more primal. Deep pits were dug to bury the dead far from the world of the living. Temples were closed, and improvised rituals emerged to repel what many saw as a divine curse. In some towns, people abandoned their homes and fled into the forests, believing the air there would be purer, less tainted by the sins of civilization. But the plague made no distinction between city and countryside. It only needed a chance. And those chances multiplied. Spring fairs, regional markets, religious processions, military camps, all were ideal grounds for its spread. Fleas and rats traveled unchecked. People touched one another, broke bread together, confessed their sins, embraced in prayer. Every form of human connection unknowingly served as a conduit for the disease. Meanwhile, the Rhine River, Europe's great artery, became a highway of infection. Barges that once carried wheat, wine, and wool now transported death. Riverside cities like Strasbourg and Cologne began finding bodies on their shores, hearing stories of entire families vanishing without a word. No one knew exactly when it had begun or how to stop it. They only knew that each day, the plague crept a few steps further, as if following a path laid out long ago. Efforts to contain it were, at best, naive. Patrols were formed to monitor travelers. Letters were sealed with holy wax. Perfumes were scattered through the streets, and flowers were placed on windowsills to purify the supposedly tainted air. The miasma theory, that disease spread through foul vapors, dominated the period's thinking. Though incorrect, it reflected a desperate attempt to make sense of the incomprehensible. In other regions, such as Tyrol and southern Austria, early reports emerged of flagellants. Groups of men and women marched from town to town, whipping themselves with leather cords, chanting songs of guilt and penance. It was believed that if this evil was punishment for human sin, then voluntary suffering might placate divine wrath. The streets filled with these penitents, who moved from city to city like a parallel religious current, a church of pain which, unwittingly, also helped spread the plague wherever they went. Each step the plague took beyond the Alps confirmed its boundless ambition. It was no longer a catastrophe confined to ports or densely populated cities. Its advance proved that even the remotest valleys, the highest castles, the humblest villages could be reached. And worst of all, its arrival could not be predicted. Sometimes it took weeks to leap from one town to the next. Sometimes it arrived in a single night, without anyone understanding how. The impact was not only physical, it was spiritual. Churches began to empty, not out of lack of faith, but for fear of crowds. Communion, the sacred act of sharing bread and wine, was suspended in many regions. Funerals were avoided. Confessions were made at a distance. Some priests abandoned their parishes. Others died trying to fulfill their duty to the end. The link between the divine and the human was strained, and many souls once confident in eternal salvation began to suspect that perhaps there would be no salvation at all. So it was that, while spring bloomed across the fields of Central Europe, the black wind continued its path. It had crossed the Alps, flooded valleys, ignited fires of intolerance, and left behind a transformed Europe. But it was not finished. The next step was France. the political and cultural heart of the continent. And the plague was already prepared to leave its deepest mark there. In the hills of Provence and along the dusty roads of southern France, the first rats were already running free. The next spark was already lit. Paris and the dance of the physicians. When the plague swept across the fields of Provence and began to cast its shadow over southern France, Paris, still unaware of the full scale of the disaster, clung tightly to its rituals of power, knowledge, and custom. The city was the intellect of the kingdom, the heart of the monarchy, a boiling cauldron of nobles, clergy, merchants, beggars, students, and pilgrims. Paris pulsed with intensity in every corner, between the narrow streets, under the bell towers of Notre Dame, and inside the lecture halls of the Sorbonne. Life seemed to carry on, unsuspecting that the catastrophe approaching from the south was about to steal its rhythm, its sanity, and its voice. However, the plague respected no prestige, no centers of learning. It had ravaged Florence, shattered Genoa's foundations, and filled the streets of Marseille with corpses. And when it began to advance toward Paris, it moved with chilling precision, as if it knew that the city held not just bodies to infect, but ideas to shake. In Paris, more than in any other place in medieval Europe, the disease would be confronted with words. It was thought, discussed, theorized. And amidst the agony, a strange ritual of intellect and superstition emerged. The dance of the physicians. In 1348, when the first firm rumors reached the capital, King Philip VI summoned the University of Paris, the most influential Christian university in the world, to issue an official explanation for the nature of the evil. This was more than a political gesture. It was a way to reaffirm that even outdated knowledge still had to offer answers. A group of the most reputed physicians and astrologers from the faculty was convened. Men who had devoted their lives to interpreting the texts of Aristotle, Galen, and Avicenna, now forced to face a phenomenon that fit none of the established treatises. After days of deliberation, they produced a lengthy report attempting to explain the plague's origin and propagation. They asserted that the disease was not the result of a direct earthly cause, but of an astral conjunction in 1345. A particular alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had upset the balance of the elements and contaminated the air with harmful vapors. This document, known as the Compendium de Epidemia, was circulated throughout Europe and regarded for years as medical authority. Though from today's perspective, it aligns more closely with astrology than science. At the time, it was the best that reason could offer. And while the physicians constructed celestial diagrams and devised explanations based on bodily humors, death continued to spread through the streets. The symptoms in Paris were identical to those that had devastated Italy and Switzerland. High fevers, painful buboes in the armpits and groin, black spots covering the body, blood and vomit, delirium. Sometimes death came in 3 days, sometimes in 1. Some victims collapsed before any visible signs appeared. The speed of the affliction made real control impossible. In the midst of this confusion, peculiar figures emerged. Physicians, who had until then been treated with respect, came to inspire fear or laughter. The first individuals wearing long robes, leather gloves, and bird beak masks filled with aromatic herbs, spices, and vinegar began to appear. These ingredients were believed to purify the air and block noxious vapors from entering the body. Clad in their slow, deliberate steps among the dying, these physicians quickly became a recurring vision in Paris, their image the symbol of an era, knowledge impotent, wrapped in theatrical disguise. Despite their efforts, many physicians perished. Others fled. Some began charging astronomical fees for visits, and charlatans posing as experts seized the moment. In the plazas, healers offered every remedy imaginable: rosewater, pearl dust, mandrake root, sulfur infusions. Everything was sold. Everything was tried, Fear had obliterated the boundary between knowledge and delirium. Paris, like the other great cities, began to rot from within. Already filthy and overcrowded, the streets became avenues of plague. Markets were abandoned. Houses were sealed shut. Churches, once packed with worshippers and the dead alike, began to close their doors. Processions were banned to prevent contagion, but the desperate continued to gather in secret to pray or self-flagellate, as though suffering could persuade death to pass them by. In cemeteries, space ran out. Common graves were dug in the outskirts. Corpses were piled along the banks of the Seine. The river, which had fed the city for centuries, became a sewer filled with dead animals, infected linens, and sometimes entire bodies. The stench was unbearable. Some wrote that Paris had ceased to be a city and had become an immense hospital with no cure. Social fabric began to tear. The poor died en masse, but the rich were not spared. Many nobles fled to rural chateaux believing the plague would not reach them. Some survived. Others died in isolation. No servants, no confessors, no mercy. At the universities, studies were suspended. Students returned to their homes carrying the virus with them. Each departure, each caravan, became a new chapter in the spread. Amid it all, the figure of the physician danced in circles. Not a literal dance, but a choreography of trials and errors, a desperate ballet ranging from the ridiculous to the heroic. Some refused to abandon their patients, sleeping beside them and dying in their spirals. Others never touched a sick person, observing from a distance and prescribing empty formulas. Some studied bodies ravaged by disease and began to suspect that something new, something never seen before, was at work. But they had no name. They had no weapons. And meanwhile, traditional knowledge began to crumble. The explanations of scholars, which for centuries had underpinned European thought, now seemed fragile, outdated, disconnected from the reality in the streets. The authority of the written word, the blind faith in ancient texts, came under painful scrutiny. Thought, once the refuge of the elite, was now leveled with the prayers of the common people. And in the midst of smoke, cries, and lament, something new began to take shape, something that long after would give birth to change. But it was too early to understand it. In 1348's Paris, the only certainty was that death was everywhere, that theories offered no salvation, that science had begun its clumsy dance amid catastrophe. And as the heart of France choked under its own pestilence across the Channel, England watched the ships crossing with ever smaller crews. The plague had already started to stretch its fingers toward the Isles. The next act was about to begin. The United Kingdom in flames. In the year 1348, while Paris drowned in its own suffering and death bells tolled from Provence to the Rhine, a heavy breeze drifted across the English Channel, carrying with it something denser than the salty humidity, more penetrating than the chill of spring. The Kingdom of England, still entangled in continental wars and preoccupied with dynastic disputes, began to hear, like a distant thunder rumbling across a quiet countryside, rumors of a death that arrived by sea, of entire cities turned into tombs, of mothers burying their children with bare hands. No one yet knew how near the disaster truly was, but the stench was already in the air. The first point of entry was the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset, a modest spot on England's southern coast where merchant ships regularly docked from the continent. There, sometime in the summer of that fateful year, a vessel from Gascony arrived carrying wine, textiles, and something not listed in any manifest: the plague. The rats hidden among the barrels, the fleas clinging to the fabric, and the sailors who disembarked with pale skin and vacant eyes were the true heralds of collapse. At first, the local authorities did not grasp what was unfolding. It was an unusual illness, yes, but it seemed manageable. Coastal towns were used to occasional outbreaks: typhoid, dysentery, measles. But within days, the symptoms multiplied with a violence no physician, no priest, no village elder could explain. The sick sweated through their garments, their bodies covered in black spots and swollen buboes. Their screams tore through the night, and within hours they lay still, twisted, rigid, lifeless. People began dying so quickly, in such numbers, that this was no common epidemic. It was something deeper, something that seemed to rise from the bowels of hell. From Dorset, the disease spread as if carried by the soil itself. To the west, it reached Devon and Cornwall. To the east, it advanced along the coast to Southampton, and from there, via overland trade routes, it pierced the heart of England. London, the pulsing center of the realm, began to tremble long before the plague reached its gates. The rumors arrived first. Travelers, messengers, clergymen fleeing from the south, all spoke of unburied corpses, of dogs tearing flesh from bodies in the streets, of physicians who took their own lives before falling ill. Each story intensified the fear, and with fear came disarray. In the countryside, the situation was no better. England, deeply shaped by its feudal structure, relied on peasant labor for survival. When farmhands began to fall ill and die in great numbers, the fields went unplowed, the wheat rotted, livestock wandered aimlessly. The feudal lords, most of them protected behind walls, soon realized that their privileges were useless if there was no one to bake their bread, milk their cows, or mend their garments. The system began to crumble from its foundations. Meanwhile, London waited. The capital, a dense, chaotic, vibrant city, prepared as best it could. King Edward III, caught between the demands of war with France and the growing dread in the streets, began to receive conflicting reports. At first, he ordered ports closed to ships arriving from infected areas. Later, realizing this was insufficient, he attempted to enforce travel restrictions, collective prayers, and mandatory fasting. But each measure came too late. By the time a decision was enacted, the plague had already crossed another street. The first major outbreak in London erupted in Southwark, south of the River Thames. From there, it spread eastward to the city, then crossed bridges and fanned out through the metropolis. The poorest neighborhoods were the first to fall. In the crammed wooden homes where entire families shared a single bed, contagion was instant. Slowly, death made its way to the wealthy, to the clergy, to members of the royal court. Westminster Palace turned into a site of whispered prayers, and Queen Philippa withdrew to the countryside with her children, hoping to isolate them from infection. Cemeteries were overwhelmed. In the eastern part of the city, a new burial ground was opened, now known as Charterhouse Square, where tens of thousands of bodies were interred. Deep trenches were dug, the dead were stacked like firewood, covered with lime, and a fresh layer of corpses was laid above. It was mechanical work, devoid of words or mourning. The silence of the gravediggers spoke louder than any funeral rite. The one who dug graves in the morning could be dead by nightfall. As the disease continued its merciless advance, paranoia deepened. The few doctors still alive and practicing, overwhelmed and powerless, proposed absurd treatments: vinegar baths, bloodletting, special diets of garlic and onions, even concoctions with powdered emerald and molten gold. Nothing worked. Believing the air itself was poisoned, massive bonfires were lit in public squares, aromatic herbs were burned, and citizens were forced to carry handkerchiefs soaked in resins. Dogs and cats were blamed for spreading the disease and ordered exterminated, ironically worsening the problem by allowing rats, the true carriers, to thrive unchecked. In monasteries, the plague was devastating. Dozens of religious communities were wiped out. In some abbeys, every monk died within a week. The clergy, long the spiritual pillar of the realm, was reduced to a handful of survivors. Faith, when confronted with evil on such a scale, began to falter. Some claimed it was the end of days. Others saw the plague as divine punishment, a purging before renewal. But the common people, weary of celestial explanations, began to seek more earthly answers, and with that, distrust of those who had long claimed to hold the truth took root. The kingdom's very structure began to shake. Parliament was suspended, laws went unenforced, official records stopped. For months, England functioned without effective government. It was a nation abandoned to survival. Villages barricaded themselves, cities expelled outsiders. Some towns were entirely deserted and would never be inhabited again. When the plague finally began to recede, not through human intervention, but due to biological exhaustion, a lack of new victims, and shifts in climate, the United Kingdom was unrecognizable. Around a third of the population had vanished. Empty churches, fallow fields, and silent homes told of a country transformed at its core. But from that devastation, something unexpected emerged. The survivors began to demand more rights, more land, more freedom. And so, amid the ashes, a seed of change took root. The plague, without intending to, had ignited a fire that consumed not only lives, but ideas. And while England buried its dead and Europe continued to count its own, something dark moved northward. The fjords, the frozen harbors, the northern lands would receive the plague too, but with a different slowness, a colder rhythm, more contained. Scandinavia did not yet know, but the wind had already shifted. The Kingdom of the Dead. When the last autumn leaves fell upon the cobbled roads of Europe, and the cold began to seep into the bones of the survivors, the plague was no longer just a disease, not even a catastrophe. It had become a condition of the world. It was the new air people breathed, the new music ringing from the bells, the new color of the earth. In that moment, and perhaps only in that precise historical instant, Europe ceased to be a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and cities, and became a single territory, uniform, silent, and shattered, the kingdom of the dead. Everyday life, which had barely endured through the first months of the epidemic, collapsed under the accumulated weight of corpses, fear, and abandonment. This was no longer a series of disconnected outbreaks. It had become a constant state, a backdrop that invaded everything. The streets were deserted, the bells rang endlessly, and even language itself changed. To speak of life began to sound naive, like a word from the past. What remained was survival, instinct, hollow-eyed stares exchanged without words, and the sound of carts going back and forth like endless funeral processions. Gravediggers became central figures, more important than priests, judges, or lords. Roughly dressed men, with cloths tied across their faces and thick leather gloves, roamed towns and cities collecting bodies as if they were firewood. They worked in pairs or in groups, with cracked skin and lifeless eyes. They carried hooks, ropes, torches. Some dragged the dead by the ankles. Others slung them over their shoulders. No one asked who was who. Names were no longer recognized. A body was just that, a thing that needed to disappear before it could infect the living. There was no time for prayers or tears. Grief had been overtaken by urgency. Traditional cemeteries collapsed. Overwhelmed parishes improvised mass graves in vacant lots, outside the city walls, or even in monastery gardens. Trenches were dug as deep as the earth allowed, and bodies were piled until space ran out. Then they were covered with lime, buried under a layer of soil, and the next day, another trench was opened beside it. Chronicles speak of places where graves reached more than 10 layers of corpses, one atop another, nameless, without coffins, without any form of identification. Tombstones were no longer carved, because no one was left to pay for them, and because it no longer made sense to mark a grave among so many. In the hardest-hit cities, the stench was so overwhelming that authorities ordered constant fires to purify the air. Aromatic woods, herbs, vinegar-soaked rags, anything that could make breathing more bearable, were burned. but the fire could not dispel the invisible. Improvised funeral pyres were also lit, often burning out of control. In Florence, in Paris, in London, there are accounts of entire neighborhoods being evacuated so that homes could be burned with the dead still inside, out of fear that contaminated bodies would continue to spread the plague. Horror became routine. And still, the most unsettling part was the calm. For the plague did not always come in waves. There were moments of silence, of empty streets, of entire villages without a sound, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. In some rural areas, travelers stumbled upon towns where doors hung open, plates remained on tables, beds were unmade, and not a single soul remained. Animals wandered the yards. Chimneys, long cold, had not smoked for days. Sometimes, in the midst of the silence, a lone child would appear, or an old woman sitting in front of a cold oven. The plague left gaps, not just graves. It left entire regions uninhabited. And what came next was even more sinister, a moral hollowing. For in the face of prolonged catastrophe, the human spirit begins to erode. Bonds unravel. Social obligations dissolve. In many cities, guards abandoned their posts. Judges deserted their courts. Castle gates were left wide open. The sense of time was lost. No one knew what day it was anymore, or how long had passed since the last burial. Life without a calendar is a mirage. Only the repetition remained of the same gesture to survive one more day. Even the relationship with death changed. Corpses no longer provoked weeping. It became common to see children helping push carts of bodies, women carrying their husbands' corpses to leave them at the doors of shuttered churches, men walking among the dead with complete indifference, searching only for something they could sell or eat. Some even began to exhume recent graves, not out of malice but necessity, to retrieve a clean tunic, a pair of shoes, a stray trinket that could be exchanged for a crust of bread. Amid this collapse, strange phenomena arose. In some parts of the Holy Roman Empire, cases of what we would now call collective madness were recorded. Entire groups of people began dancing in town squares until they collapsed from exhaustion, as if the body sought to release what the mind could no longer bear. In other places, mock funeral processions were held, without the dead, just people dressed in black, chanting solemn hymns, dragging empty crosses. The symbol became stronger than reality. People wept not only for those already gone, but for those certain to die tomorrow. And in the midst of all this chaos, some continued to write. A few chroniclers, locked away in towers or monasteries, documented the advance of the plague with painful precision. They recorded the names of vanished villages, impossible death tolls, apocalyptic visions. Thanks to them, we know there were places where 80% of the population perished, that there were parishes left without a single priest, that some regions took generations to recover. These texts were not written with the hope of being read soon. They were like messages cast into the sea, knowing that the known world was vanishing. The kingdom of the dead was not just a metaphor, it was a real geography. During those long, gray, wintry months, Europe became a suspended civilization. The wheel of history stopped spinning. Politics ceased to matter. Wars were put on hold. Debts were no longer collected. Weddings went uncelebrated. It was as if time itself had been infected. And yet even there, amid that kingdom of silence and decay, life did not disappear completely. There were always a few who endured, a few who healed in secret, a few who sang, a few who, against all logic, planted a handful of seeds beside a mass grave, believing that perhaps, if the earth had not completely died, something green might still sprout in spring. Because when all seems lost, when even the air becomes the enemy, life still finds its way through the cracks. In the distance, on the far side of that endless winter, the first shoots of fanaticism were beginning to appear, of blame, of hatred. Because the plague did not only kill bodies, it unleashed monsters. And in the following chapters of this story, Europe would witness how fear, once sown, could grow into fury. The plague had not yet spoken its final word. The Flagellants, punishment and fanaticism. When horror surpasses all understanding, when prayers seem to bounce off a silent sky and death walks freely through the streets, what remains is neither logic nor reason, but the most primal impulse of the human mind, the need to find meaning in suffering. Amid the disaster that had turned Europe into a continent of graves and ashes, a spectral figure emerged, a procession of bloodied, whipped bodies filled with devotion, marching through towns and cities with a message as old as sin itself. If the world is collapsing, it is because God is punishing it. And if God punishes, then we must plead. We must suffer. We must bleed. Thus the Flagellants were born. And during the darkest years of the Black Death, their presence was so visible, so theatrical, and so deeply disturbing that, even amidst overflowing cemeteries and empty temples, they managed to stand out as a living sign of collective despair. The first organized groups appeared in Germany around the year 1349, just as the epidemic was reaching its peak in Central Europe. They seemed, at first glance, like ordinary Christian penitents, laymen without direct ties to the clergy, who had abandoned their homes to form brotherhoods of spiritual purification. Dressed in white robes adorned with red crosses on the chest and back, they marched in single file along rural paths, chanting Latin hymns and stopping in public squares where, at dusk, their ritual began. They stripped bare from the waist up, knelt down, and began to flog themselves with hardened leather whips, some tipped with metal, until their backs were drenched in blood, like a new, red and silent garment. The scene was brutal, yet magnetic. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of men walked for 33 days, one for each year of Christ's life, stopping in cities and villages to lash their bodies in an attempt to intercede with divine wrath. They sang distorted psalms, preached that the final judgment was near, that the world was being purged of its pride, and that only sincere pain could save the soul. They whipped one another, embraced while covered in blood, wept publicly, and then kept walking. Each night, the same spectacle. Each city, a station on their own way of the cross. To many, they seemed like messengers from on high. The church, overwhelmed by the scale of the catastrophe, had begun to lose authority, and the Flagellants were quick to fill the void. They did not speak from pulpits, but from the mud, from open wounds. Their pain was visible. Their faith, radical. They did not speak of future salvation, but of present punishment. And in a Europe no longer looking for comfort, but merely for an explanation, they became both voice and symbol. However, what began as a movement of extreme devotion soon took on a darker tone. As their numbers grew, so did their power. In some regions of the Holy Roman Empire, they forced local authorities to receive them, to supply their ranks, to lend them churches and squares. In other cases, they entered convents to preach their message, discredited bishops, accused the clergy of failure, of having abandoned the people in the midst of the plague. There were even cases where they burned religious images they deemed corrupt, destroyed documents, and expelled priests from their own temples, declaring them unworthy. And wherever they passed, the plague followed. Not because they were to blame, but because their pilgrimages unknowingly coincided with the disease's spread. In many towns, they were initially welcomed with enthusiasm, only to be blamed days later when the first deaths appeared. Some chroniclers recount how, in certain regions, residents began to shut their doors to them, hurl stones, beg them not to stop. But the fervor was unstoppable. Where they were rejected, they kept walking. Where they were embraced, they multiplied. Their advance ran parallel to the collapse, fanaticism grew, and with it, violence. Some groups began to believe that enemies walked among them, earthly culprits behind the plague. Speeches arose against Jews, foreign merchants, heretics, anyone who refused to submit to the soul's self-flagellation. Some of these mobs, now entirely out of control, did not just pray. They burned houses, raided Jewish quarters, dragged suspected witches into public squares, and exposed them to the crowd. Pain, when it finds no answers, often seeks scapegoats. The church, which had at first watched them with a degree of tolerance, began to grow uneasy. Pope Clement VI, sheltered in Avignon, feared these spontaneous movements could become a theological and political threat. He issued a papal bull condemning their practices and sent envoys to Germany and France to disperse them. In some cases, their influence was reduced. In others, the Flagellants simply splintered, changed their names, hid in forests, or disbanded after completing their 33 days of penance. But the impact was already made. The image of the flogged body, of the face enraptured in the midst of pain, was seared into the collective memory of the age. It represented something that words could not express. The need for control in the face of the uncontrollable, for order in the face of chaos, for redemption in the midst of hell. It was a visceral, primitive, deeply human response to a tragedy that seemed to have no end. The plague did not vanish with the Flagellants. On the contrary, it continued its course, indifferent to whips, prayers, or processions. But something had shifted. Society was beginning to fracture not just because of the number of deaths, but because of the ideas that were starting to germinate among the living. The old world, with its clear hierarchies, solid dogmas, and immovable structures, was beginning to tremble. And while the wounds on their backs slowly healed, the wounds in the mind and the soul had only just begun to open. From that moment on, the plague was not merely a disease. It became a mirror, and in it, Europe began to see a face it did not wish to recognize. Very soon, hatred and the need to find someone to blame would take on another form, and there would be no procession, no penance, capable of containing what was to come next. Scapegoats, Jews, witches, and hatred. As the Black Death consumed the physical and moral foundations of Europe, leaving behind empty cities, fallow fields, and a silence too deep for hope, a force emerged that proved even more corrosive than the plague itself: directionless fear, panic without answers, and when the true enemy cannot be named, it is easier to invent one. Because when death becomes the norm and logic collapses, what remains is the hunt, the accusation, the rage dressed as justice. And so it was that, at the heart of the worst health catastrophe of the Middle Ages, men didn't only flee the plague, they began to hunt each other. The first target was clear, and for many, convenient: the Jewish community. Scattered across Europe, with a strong presence in commercial, banking, or university cities, Jews lived under a system of watch tolerance. They were accepted for economic and political expediency, but remained socially and culturally isolated, often forced to inhabit segregated neighborhoods, wear visible markers, and live under separate laws. The old undercurrent of anti-Semitic suspicion, dormant for centuries, found in the plague a fierce catalyst. People claimed that Jews were not dying as often as Christians, a falsehood, but one that persisted, and that their neighborhoods were less affected. This was taken as proof that they knew something the rest of the population didn't. Rumors spread that they had poisoned the wells, that they used strange powders to contaminate the water, that the plague was the result of a secret conspiracy against Christians. No proof was needed. Suspicion was enough. Repetition of the rumor was enough. A confession extracted under torture was enough. In Switzerland, Germany, France, and the northern kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, pogroms erupted. Jews were dragged into public squares, burned alive, drowned in rivers, stoned by praying mobs. In Basel, during the winter of 1349, the authorities allowed hundreds of Jews to be locked inside a wooden house by the Rhine, which was then set ablaze. In Strasbourg, shortly afterward, over 2,000 were killed in a single day. Contracts, baptisms, past loyalties, none of it mattered. Once labeled a scapegoat, the entire community was condemned. Some cities expelled the survivors. Others forced Jews to confess to impossible crimes and then executed them. In some cases, even longtime neighbors, those who had traded, shared streets, and daily routines with Jewish families, became their accusers without a second thought. Hatred, once it finds a channel, flows easily, like a river freed from its banks. And in a broken, terrified Europe, littered with corpses, the figure of the Jew came to embody everything that could not be explained. The Church tried, in some cases, to halt the wave of violence. Pope Clement VI, from Avignon, issued papal bulls condemning the attacks, reminding the faithful that the plague affected everyone equally, even declaring that the Jews were not to blame. But his words came too late and were drowned in a climate where mass hysteria overwhelmed all authority. Furthermore, many local clergy, driven by the same fear as their congregants, encouraged the violence or tolerated it with complicit silence. In many places, religion was not a brake, but a fuel. But the hunt for scapegoats didn't end with the Jews. Soon, others fell under the accusing gaze of the crowd. Women, especially those who lived alone, who practiced herbal medicine, who had inherited ancient knowledge, began to be labeled as witches. People claimed the plague was the result of spells, demonic pacts, curses cast by women who hated life. They said witches spoke with death, that they guided it to certain homes, that they smeared poisonous ointments on doors. Suddenly, an old woman gathering roots in the forest became a threat, an enemy of God. Fear turned healing hands into something dangerous. Although the full-blown witch hunts would not arrive until the following century, the Black Death planted the seed of irrational hatred toward women who stepped outside the established mold. Many were tortured, burned, drowned. In some towns, makeshift trials were held, often without any legal authority, and the accused were publicly executed as a warning. The punishment itself was not the point. It was the spectacle. Because in the utter confusion of the plague, violence gave people the illusion of control. Beggars, foreigners, lepers, the mentally ill, and those with physical deformities also came to be seen as bearers of guilt. In the distorted logic of the time, any difference was suspicious, any anomaly potentially malevolent. Those who fled the contagion were accused of spreading it. Those who survived were interrogated. Those with sick relatives were treated as if they carried the punishment itself. The human body, once a symbol of shared existence, became a marker of threat. Delirious theories spread. Some claimed the plague could be transmitted by looking at certain symbols. Others believed the stars revealed the guilty. There were even those who insisted the dead could return as shadows to punish the living. Everything seemed possible, and the worst part was that each absurd explanation, rather than soothing the fear, inflamed the thirst for vengeance. Because absurdity, when shared collectively, gains the appearance of truth. And so, Europe was not only covered in death, but in innocent blood. The plague did not ask about religion, language, or gender. But society, in its collapse, did. And in doing so, it revealed the darkest parts of itself. While physicians looked to the stars and scholars to ancient texts, the masses looked for culprits among their neighbors. Fear found its voice in accusation, and pain in the flames of the pyre. Yet as dark as this chapter may be, it too is part of the full portrait. Because a tragedy is not only measured by the number of dead, but by what it does to the living. And what the Black Death did to Europe was to strip it, for a time, of its deepest sense of community. It laid bare a moral fragility that neither walls, nor laws, nor prayers could hide. Hatred momentarily soothed what reason could not explain. And as the flames burned in the fields and the squares, the plague marched on, indifferent, unchanging, as if none of it had any effect on its advance. Because the plague, in the end, needed no allies or culprits. It only needed bodies, and Europe kept offering them. Hunger after death. When the bells stopped tolling and the corpse carts became scarce, it wasn't because the plague had ceased or life had regained control, but because the dead no longer needed to be collected. They lay everywhere, decomposing among the ruins of what had once been an ordered civilization. But amid that absolute desolation, while the city still reeked of lime and ash, a new enemy appeared, just as cruel as the previous one, though less visible, less sudden, slower, more agonizing: hunger. Europe, exhausted after years of plague, now entered the second act of its tragedy. Once the bodies stopped piling up in the squares and monasteries, it became clear that the fields were empty, the markets deserted, the pantries locked, and the trade routes as broken as human relationships. The Black Death had been a fire, but what followed was a drought. The continent, decimated in both numbers and will, faced the brutal truth. There were no longer enough hands to make bread grow. During the worst months of the outbreak, agricultural production had come to a near standstill. The peasants who sowed, harvested, tended animals, repaired mills, or transported grain to the cities had died by the millions. There was no time for planting when the urgent task was to bury one's own children. No plow moved when the plague reached a village. Many fields were abandoned, overtaken by weeds, vermin, and forgetfulness. Cows turned feral. Goats vanished into the woods. Chickens starved to death inside coops whose owners never returned. In the cities, which depended entirely on supplies from the countryside, the collapse was immediate. Wheat became scarce, meat disappeared, milk turned into a luxury. The ovens went cold. Markets had no open stalls, and the few that remained operated like desperate auctions, where a piece of moldy cheese might cost a fortune. Bread, when it could be found, was hard, stale, unleavened. Salt was traded like gold. The old, who remembered hard times, had no comparison to draw. This wasn't a bad harvest. It was the absence of a world. The logic of scarcity took root without resistance. Eating became not a basic right, but a silent, ferocious competition. Families locked themselves away with whatever they had. Crumbs were rationed. Soups were boiled with bitter roots, scraps of bark, and old bones. Hunger drove people to eat leather shoes, parchment books, the dried remains of dead animals. And when nothing was left, they consumed despair. The chronicles that survived this period are filled with phrases modern readers can scarcely process without shuddering. In some regions of southern France, there were reports of children abandoned along roads with stones in their mouths, deceived by their parents into thinking they were chewing something. In German cities, rumors spread of secret ovens where human corpses were cooked. In villages of Eastern Europe, dogs and cats were hunted like livestock. Some mothers, driven mad, ate their newborns. These weren't tavern tales. They were real testimonies, recorded by scribes who wrote with trembling hands, knowing that the written word was the only thing that might outlast death. Hunger lacked the theatricality of the plague, but its humiliation ran deeper. It didn't take life in a day, but in weeks. It made the body fragile, the skin cling to the bones, the joints crack when moved. But the worst was its effect on the soul. Hunger erased compassion. A neighbor who once shared wine now hid his pots. A grandmother who once prayed for all now refused a crust to her grandson. The starving body leaves little room for virtue. And if there's one thing that defines profound crises, it's that they sweep away everything that once seemed firm. The feudal order, which had structured rural life for generations, collapsed. Lords could no longer force peasants to work their lands, because the peasants were either gone or wandering, seeking better terms. In some areas, the surviving serfs demanded wages, demanded land, demanded freedom. And the most unsettling part, they got it. Hunger triggered a brutal redistribution of wealth. An abandoned house was taken, a stray cow was claimed. Law ceased to exist when justice was buried beneath the soil. Rulers tried to contain the chaos with decrees. Prices were regulated. Hoarding was forbidden. Trade was ordered to resume by royal edict. But the economy no longer responded. Bonds of trust had been severed. Many roads were unsafe, overrun by bandits, stray soldiers, people with nothing left to lose. Mills were raided, warehouses burned. Villages no longer wished to supply cities, and cities had nothing left to trade. To this bleak panorama was added a natural enemy, the climate. The years following the plague were, in many places, unusually cold and rainy. The few crops that were attempted drowned in storms or perished in unexpected frosts. It was as if nature itself had decided to prolong the punishment. What the plague hadn't killed, hunger broke. And what hunger didn't destroy, time abandoned. Yet in the midst of utter misery, a slow underground change began to take shape. The surviving communities realized they had to reorganize. Some villages regrouped, others vanished from the map forever. In certain regions, land was redistributed. What had once been impossible, like a serf cultivating his own plot without paying tithe, now became acceptable. New settlements were founded on the ruins of the old. Spontaneous cooperatives emerged. Alliances were forged among the few who remained, because it was no longer a matter of politics or religion, it was a matter of eating. Women, often left as heads of entire households after the loss of husbands and sons, began to make economic decisions. The female social role shifted, not from ideology but from necessity. They became administrators, foragers, protectors. Hunger blurred hierarchies, and although that transformation was painful, it left lasting marks. Hunger, like the plague, eventually passed. But its imprint was different. It didn't leave corpses in the streets, but gaps in memory, changes in human relationships, cracks in institutions. It was the final stage of the collapse and the beginning of a slow, rudimentary reconstruction. And as the fields began, ever so timidly, to turn green again, the scars remained visible. Europe had lost a part of itself, but what would come next would be even stranger. A weakened nobility, an empowered peasantry, a questioned church, and above all, a lingering question. What does it truly mean to survive when everything that once surrounded you is gone? The answer, as always, would come with time. But for now, death was no longer the only threat. Because sometimes, the silence left by an empty stomach can echo louder than any tolling bell. A Mourning Crown. The plague respected neither age nor status, and as it rose like an implacable shadow over Europe, it reached those who seemed inviolable: monarchs, princes, bishops. Where power once shimmered with pomp, a collective funeral unfolded. The stained glass ceased to reflect the sheen of authority. The crown succumbed to the same fever as the peasant. The nobility sank into mourning and demoralization. Europe, in that moment, realized that no diadem could protect against it. One of the most emblematic cases was that of Edward III of England. Under his reign, England had consolidated its presence on the continental mainland and cultivated a sense of expansion. Yet when the plague reached the southern coasts of England, the royal court fractured. Vassals and ministers died. Trusted staff vanished without a trace. Official correspondence halted, and offices closed. The king, isolated at Windsor or in the countryside, watched helplessly as his power collapsed in unprecedented fashion. His authority, built on war and diplomacy, became a powerless symbol, a throne surrounded by shadows. Although Edward survived, his wife, Queen Philippa of Hainault, lived in constant fear of infection. Their children ran fevers, and at certain points the court mandated collective prayers and fasts to solicit divine mercy. It was a moment when the proud English crown was forced to acknowledge its human vulnerability and sing psalms just to stay upright. That morning, observed in royal courts and nearby churches, reflected the fear that spanned every social stratum. If death could reach a monarch, it could reach anyone. In the region of Castile, the crown of Peter I was likewise compelled to confront its fragility. From the court in Burgos to the monasteries of the north, deaths among the nobility and within the very heart of the feudal system were recorded. Entire convents closed as epidemics swept through the vassals. The economy, strained by the absence of laborers and delayed harvests, collapsed. The monarch, accustomed to dispensing privileges, found himself presiding over a broken realm, monitored by wheat oligopolies and threatened by uprisings against landowners. Elsewhere in the Holy Roman Empire under Emperor Charles IV of Bohemia, the plague was a dagger that pierced the layers of power. Central officials vanished, electoral princes sealed off their territories, and the Confederated States, many scattered, began to deliberate in seclusion. Authorities' decentralization intensified. The very concept of empire was seriously undermined. Princes and bishops, both political and religious figures, could not evade either physical or moral contagion. Power began to mutate into a fragile entity, lit by candles hours earlier used for coronation ceremonies. In other parts of Europe, royalty dispatched envoys merely to verify the survival of entire regions. Crowns had become more image than effective symbol, and the spectacle of power lost its charisma. To maintain the loyalty of feudal lords, monarchs had to promise subsidies, forgive taxes, and distribute offices. It was the crown asking for compassion rather than the other way around. This royal mourning marked a paradigm shift. The deaths of untold numbers of nobles created gaps in administration, finances, and military command. Unprecedented solutions were needed. The sale of royal lands, cuts to palace expenses, rapid marriage alliances, and urgent contracts with craftsmen to rebuild sanitary and religious infrastructure. The aristocracy, whose prestige rested on inheritance and lineage, found itself in a dilemma: how to preserve its status in a world where the plague had pulverized the foundations of its ancestral power. For the most ambitious nobles, it became an opportunity. Men with borrowed titles appeared, buying vacant lands, marrying heiresses without brothers, and legislating amid crisis. Secondary families rose to noble status, exploiting the generational losses wrought by the plague. It was a silent social recomposition, woven into the fabric of mourning and devastation. In short, during the Black Death's deadliest years, European crowns confronted what they had never imagined: their own mortality. What had been symbols of eternity became rotting flesh, vulnerable and terrified. And after the deaths came the questioning: could a monarchy endure without vassals, a nobility without peasants, a Christendom without servants? These questions endured, laying the intellectual groundwork for the reforms that followed. Royal mourning, unknowingly, was the prelude to modernity. For when the crown dons black, it challenges not only human power, but the entire system. In that moment, Europe realized it had embarked upon a new era, one in which power would no longer be absolute by heredity, and where the people, survivors of the plague, demanded more than bread and psalms. They demanded stability, security, and justice. The Mourning Crown prepared itself for a new interpretation. The next chapter will recount how that crown faced the permanent wound the plague had inflicted on the collective consciousness. The Art of Despair. There are moments in history when art ceases to be a luxury reserved for courts or altars. There are moments when art becomes a crack, a valve, a scream trapped in the wall. During the years that followed the Black Death, European art stripped itself of its usual solemnity, moved away from the Gothic idealism that had defined it for generations, and sank, like the rest of the continent, into an abyss of shadows, of rotting flesh, of dancing bones and hollow stares. Because how could painting continue to portray angels when what people saw were crows over crumbling rooftops? How could sculpture aspire to divine perfection when the real body was falling apart in the streets? What emerged was a new way of seeing. And what Europe saw was not beautiful. It was the mirror of its trauma. In the centuries before, religious art had dominated every visual space. The frescoes in churches spoke of salvation, of the Last Judgment, of heavenly glory. Stained glass flooded the naves with colors that seemed to come from another world. But when the plague reached its peak and then retreated, leaving millions dead, that visual language became obsolete, incomplete. Hope, beauty, and harmony no longer represented the common experience. What people had seen was not a promised paradise, but a tangible hell. And art, faithful to its time, had to lower its gaze. A new iconography emerged then, deeply disturbing, which no longer showed saints floating in clouds, but corpses walking. The motif of the danse macabre, dance of death, spread throughout Europe, especially in France, Germany, and Italy. On walls, in manuscripts, in stone sculptures, we began to see processions of skeletons dancing hand in hand with bishops, kings, merchants, peasants, and prostitutes, all equal, all united, all dragged with empty smiles by the relentless figure of death. These murals were not decorative. They were warnings. Painted in the dark hallways of cemeteries, on the outer walls of churches, or in monastic cloisters, they became living reminders of the fragility of existence. Death no longer appeared as a final and dignified moment, but as a constant mockery, a sinister choreography that no social class could avoid. The nobility, the church, the common people, all danced in line toward the grave. But this iconography did not come from a particular artist, nor from an enlightened patron. It came from a collective need. Artists were not seeking comfort or glory. They painted what they saw, what they feared, what hurt them. And what hurt them was everything. The human body, for example, ceased to be idealized. Flesh was no longer shown smooth or perfect. It began to be depicted in a state of decomposition. Viscera were visible. Faces were gnawed away. Eyes had no pupils. Martyred saints were portrayed with more explicit wounds, with more detailed suffering. The death of Christ, which had previously been a symbol of redemption, became bloodier, more raw, more human. A clear example of this new visual language was the work of manuscript illustrators during times of crisis. Some religious codices that had once been reserved for monks or nobles began to incorporate margins full of macabre images. In the so-called Books of Hours, designed for personal prayer, miniatures appeared showing skulls dressed as bishops, angels weeping as the world burned, demons emerging from wells like sewer rats. It was as if spirituality had been contaminated by the real experience of suffering. And it was not only the visual arts that changed. Music also transformed. Choral compositions that had once celebrated the mystery of the Eucharist or the birth of the Savior began to incorporate minor tones, dragged-out melismas, prolonged silences that evoked mourning. In the town squares, troubadours sang songs about the plague, about abandonment, about guilt. Some of these popular songs spoke of loves interrupted by fever, of fathers burying their children, of entire villages consumed by disease. They were not joyful compositions, but people sang them anyway, because art even the saddest, allows you to breathe when everything else suffocates. In the theater, traveling companies abandoned the heroic tales of knights and crusades and began to perform macabre farces, grotesque satires where death was the protagonist. Scenes were shown of incompetent doctors, of wealthy people fleeing in vain, of peasants negotiating with demons. The audience, who had already seen tragedy in the flesh, welcomed these mocking performances. Dark humor, as painful as it may be, has a purifying power. And at that moment, Europe needed to purge itself. The art of despair was, in truth, neither a current, nor a movement, nor a school. It was an atmosphere, a way of understanding the world after having watched it collapse. And although its style faded over the decades, its mark remained in entire generations of creators. Many scholars agree that this dark impulse, this urgency to portray the tragic, was what prepared the ground for the sensibility of the late Renaissance. Because after facing what was most raw, most grotesque, most inevitable, the European spirit was ready to ask again about the place of human beings in the universe. There is something deeply human in transforming horror into symbol, pain into image, emptiness into form. Art, when born from the edge, does not seek to adorn. It seeks to survive. And during the darkest years of the plague, that is exactly what it did. It did not beautify suffering. It exposed it. It did not hide death. It drew it dancing. And so, while the cities filled with ashes and the cemeteries stretched beyond the walls, there were brushes that kept working, hands that kept carving, voices that kept singing. Because even in the most absolute despair, art finds a way to keep speaking. And what it said back then, still, even today, continues to resonate. The last breath in Scandinavia. Far from the heart of Europe, where winters stretched like a centuries-old fog and fjords carved the land with the patience of ice, the Black Death was slow to arrive. And when it did, it was not with the suddenness of thunder, but like a silent wave that first confused, then terrified, and ultimately transformed the northern kingdoms forever. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden did not experience the plague at the same pace as France, Italy, or England. The disease arrived late, crossing frozen seas and sparsely patrolled trade routes. But once it infiltrated their towns and villages, it left behind a trail just as devastating as the one etched across the continent. It was the final breath of the outbreak, but no less brutal for it. In the early years of the Great Plague, the Scandinavian regions were seen as a kind of remote refuge. The cold, some believed, was a natural barrier against infection. Foreign merchants were viewed with suspicion, though not yet with fear. The stories arriving from the south, entire cities reduced to human ash, monks burying dozens per day, villages left without a single living soul, sounded like superstitious exaggerations, tales amplified by rumor. And so, the northern ports carried on with a dangerous sense of normalcy. But the plague knew nothing of latitude, nor of royal pride. One ship was enough, just one. Most scholars agree that the plague entered Scandinavia for the first time through Bergen, Norway in 1349. The port, linked to Hanseatic trade routes, received ships from England and northern Germany. Among their cargo, beyond furs, barley, and salt, came rats and fleas carrying a pestilence unlisted on any manifest. Within weeks, the first cases began to multiply, and suddenly, the ice was no longer a shield. In Norway, the plague proved especially devastating. The country, sparsely populated, with isolated communities and subsistence farming economies, collapsed faster than the more centralized powers to the south. The rural nobility lacked the resources or structure to respond. The monarchy, politically weakened, proved incapable of coordinating any effective action. Some nobles fled inland, hoping to find safety on fortified farms, but the plague reached them all the same. Others, more devout, shut themselves away with their chaplains, seeking in prayer the salvation that medicine could no longer provide. It was all in vain. One of the most symbolic events of this period was the death of King Håkon VI Magnusson. Though he survived the initial wave, his court was severely affected. Chronicles from the time speak of a ghost capital, with palaces inhabited only by dying servants and corridors echoing more with wails than footsteps. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed the idea of the state. In Norway, it is estimated that more than 50% of the population vanished within a few months. Entire villages were abandoned. Churches closed not for lack of faithful, but because no clergy remained to open them. In Denmark, the situation fared no better. Though the plague arrived slightly later, between 1351 and 1352, the impact was comparable. Agriculture ground to a halt. The feudal structure groaned under the weight of a shrinking population. The surviving serfs began negotiating their freedom with the lords, aware that the land needed hands to work it. In some cases, peasants simply moved to vacant lands without permission, establishing new communities beyond the reach of traditional law. Ironically, the plague brought a wave of empowerment to those who endured. The Danish church, deeply embedded in daily life, was also struck hard. Monasteries emptied. Religious processions, intended to contain divine wrath, became hubs of contagion. Some bishops died preaching, convinced the plague was a test sent by God. Others doubled down on harsher sermons, calling for mass penance and purges of what they deemed impurity. But the disease did not answer to sermons. It advanced with the same indifferent logic it had in Rome, Paris, or London. Sweden, for its part, experienced a more fragmented process. The country's mountainous and scattered geography meant the plague arrived in irregular waves, hitting some regions harder than others. In areas like Uppland and Södermanland, mortality rates were so high that some castles were left completely empty, with no heirs left to claim them. In more remote regions, the plague was temporarily contained, though never entirely. In this setting, the bonds between nobility and peasantry changed dramatically. New hierarchies emerged, based more on survival than on lineage. Culturally, Scandinavia responded to the trauma with dense silence. Unlike the South, where art and literature channeled despair into images and stories, the Nordic peoples chose to hold their grief within more closed structures. Even so, some ecclesiastical records, preserved in remote monasteries, describe in detail the magnitude of the collapse. In one such record, a monk writes, "The world turned white with death, and not a single song was heard the entire winter." But from that silence, in time, something new emerged. In the years that followed, Scandinavian laws began to change. The surviving kings issued decrees reorganizing land ownership, consolidating royal power over a weakened nobility, and seeking to attract labor with improved conditions. Women, many of whom inherited land due to the absence of male heirs, began to take on a more active role in rural management. The medieval structures, once so rigid before the plague, began to crack. And yet, the most striking legacy of the plague's passage through Scandinavia was not political or economic transformation. It was the emptiness. Even today, in certain regions of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, one can find remnants of medieval villages that were never rebuilt. Ruins cloaked in moss, churches where trees now grow inside the naves, fields where no one ever planted again. These places, suspended in time, bear witness to a deep wound, to a final breath that swept away an entire era. The Black Death arrived late in the north, but when it came, it did so with a force that changed everything. And when it finally subsided, it left behind a vaster, emptier, more uncertain landscape. In the stillness that followed, Scandinavia began to reinvent itself, but it did so with the memory still fresh, of silence, of cold, of breath cut short, as if the whole north had exhaled, at once, its last breath. A world bent but not broken. When the final wave faded and the Black Death at last began to loosen its grip on Europe, what remained was not a radiant dawn or a celebration of triumph, but a heavy, piercing silence, like the stillness that lingers after a long battle in which no one has truly won. Cities were incomplete, villages diminished, families shattered, and yet the world had not completely broken. It had only bent. It is hard to imagine how one rebuilds when even language has been eroded by death. Words no longer meant the same. To say neighbor evoked absences. To say God brought doubts. To say tomorrow felt almost like a provocation. And yet, against all odds, the survivors began to move. Not like conquerors, but like those who gather fragments after a storm is past. Cautiously, in pain, but with a quiet certainty. Life had to go on. Agriculture was among the first pillars to attempt to rise again. There were lands without owners, fallow fields, rusted tools, and empty granaries. But there were also mouths to feed, scattered families in need of reuniting, hunger accumulated over time. Many peasants left the places they were born, walked for days, and claimed plots that no longer belonged to anyone. Often, the nobles who once ruled those lands were gone. Monasteries, still in ruins, began offering contracts to anyone willing to sow again. The feudal order, so rigid and vertical before the plague, began to dissolve. A new pact was taking shape, more horizontal, more desperate, but also more flexible. This new social structure was not born of revolution, but of necessity. The power vacuum in many regions allowed the rise of groups once invisible. Women who had become sole heirs took control of villages. Former serfs became landowners. Surviving merchants began setting the rules in cities whose councils had been decimated. Power no longer had a single face. It became multiple, fragmented, but also more dynamic. The church, which had wavered between fear and faith during the worst moments of the plague, emerged weakened but not erased. Its temples stood empty. Many monasteries had lost their monks, and parts of the clergy had been accused of cowardice or corruption for abandoning the sick. Yet communities still needed rituals, burials, confessions, words of comfort. That forced the church to transform. New religious orders emerged, closer to the people. The training of clergy with medical knowledge was promoted. Rudimentary hospitals began to appear on the outskirts of towns, and charity became not only a virtue, but a political necessity. Knowledge, too, began to shift. Medicine, which during the plague had often been helpless and absurd, entered a phase of fertile doubt. Some physicians openly questioned the classical treatises and turned to direct observation instead of relying solely on ancient texts. The first systematic symptom records were born, the earliest notions of contagion, tentative ideas about isolation and disinfection. It was not an immediate scientific revolution, but it was the start of a break from the unquestionable authority of Galen and Aristotle. The world, bent, was beginning to ask new questions. And it wasn't only medicine that changed. The entire culture began to breathe differently. Literature became more personal. No longer limited to religious hymns or courtly chronicles, new stories emerged. Tales of fear, of love during the epidemic, of the dark humor found in days without comfort. Giovanni Boccaccio, for example, wrote his Decameron precisely in this context. Young people hiding in a villa, fleeing the plague, telling each other stories to survive the boredom and the dread. Each tale became an act of resistance, each laugh a shield. Fiction became medicine for the soul. In architecture, the cities that rebuilt did so with less grandeur, but with greater practicality. Streets were widened, walls reinforced, markets reorganized to better accommodate the flow of goods. In some cases, new cemeteries were banned within city limits, a lesson etched deeply into memory. Public squares were no longer only gathering places, but also sites of refuge. Fountains, once ornamental, became essential for hygiene. The medieval city, as it had once been known, began to evolve into something more rational, more functional, more human, perhaps. Politically, Europe learned to decentralize power, to negotiate more, to yield authority in critical moments. Some monarchs, devastated by the loss of their courts, armies, and advisors, turned to alliances with bourgeois elites, guilds, and merchants. Absolutism was still far off, but the idea of shared power was beginning to take form. The plague, without intending to, had taught that no throne stands without living people to surround it. But perhaps the deepest change, the one most difficult to measure, occurred in the very hearts of those who survived. The Black Death shattered certainties, eroded myths, dismantled mental structures that once seemed immovable. And in that void, a new way of understanding life was born. For some, it became a more material existence, more urgent, where pleasure and the present gained unprecedented value. For others, it grew into a more spiritual path, centered on death and the final judgment. Both currents coexisted, clashed, intertwined, but both emerged from the same root, having stared death in the face and walked on afterward. The world that emerged after the Black Death was a world bent, wounded, unstable, but not destroyed. Because something within the human being, something visceral, archaic, and powerful, drives us to keep going, to reinvent, to imagine another tomorrow, even when that tomorrow seems improbable. And so, step by step, Europe began to rebuild. Not to return to what it had been, that was no longer possible, but to become something else. A continent that now understood everything could vanish in a breath, but one that also knew that, so long as memory, hands, and hunger for meaning remained, the world might bend, yes, but not fully break. History would continue, and the echo of that plague centuries later would still pulse in every decision, in every fear, in every new attempt to make sense of chaos. The Immortal Echo. Once the dust settles, when the stench of corpses no longer dominates the air and the desperate murmur of prayers has been replaced by a disconcerting silence, something remains. An echo remains. And that echo, though invisible, is perhaps the most enduring form of a tragedy. The Black Death, after killing more than half of Europe in just a few years, did not truly disappear. It transformed into presence, into whisper, into a perpetual reflection that crossed centuries and civilizations without us being able to clearly point to it. It was not just a biological catastrophe, but a spiritual fracture that forever redefined the way human beings relate to death, life, the body, power, and time. The echo of the Black Death was trapped in the very skin of the cities. Many of the medieval urban centers that managed to survive did so under a new arrangement of space. Street layouts changed, with wider avenues conceived not for aesthetics, but as a response to fear. Let the air circulate. Let bodies not crowd together. Let the plague find no hiding places. New drainage systems emerged, new building regulations, and markets, once crammed into narrow alleys, were relocated to open spaces. Even church bells changed their purpose. No longer solely calls to mass, they became alarm signals for new outbreaks. Trauma became architecture. But the echo went deeper. It reached language. In the following centuries, everyday vocabulary adopted expressions born from the fear of infection. The concept of quarantine, for instance, gained strength in Italian ports, where ships were required to remain isolated for 40 days before being allowed to disembark. That number, 40, was not chosen at random. It carried religious, penitential connotations, but was also a symbolic attempt to control the uncontrollable. Over time, the term became normalized, extended, and embedded into the common sense of humanity. The Echo also shaped religious thought. Apocalyptic imagery, once confined to sacred texts or mystical visions, began to occupy the center of popular theology. It was no longer a distant possibility, but a recent memory. In sermons, the plague was interpreted as divine punishment, but also as warning, and in some cases, as a test of faith. New spiritual practices emerged in response. Flagellant processions, collective pilgrimages, extreme fasts, masses for the dead, indulgences sold as shields against future plagues. Some reformers even saw in the epidemic a sign that the clergy needed renewal from its very roots. What once was dogma began to seem fragile, and that questioning reached power. The Black Death contributed, albeit indirectly, to the breakdown of traditional political structures. With so many serfs, soldiers, scribes, and tax collectors dead, feudal systems unraveled. Crowns had to negotiate with the bourgeoisie, empty lands became currency, and many lords were forced to offer concessions to attract new vassals. Thus, without proclamations or revolutions, the plague planted the seed of a Europe less static, more fluid, more open to new forms of authority. In literature, the Echo became metaphor. The plague was invoked again and again as a symbol of evil, chaos, and moral collapse. Authors like Petrarch and Chaucer used it as a backdrop for their works, not only for realism, but because they understood that the plague spoke of something greater, the limit. The moment when civilizations realize they are not invulnerable. In every tale of closed villages, piled up bodies, and physicians without answers, there was also a warning. And that warning remained alive, generation after generation. But it was in painting that the Echo took on its most haunting form. Even in later centuries, when the plague no longer dominated Europe as it had in the 14th century, artists continued to depict it. In religious paintings, the Virgin was shown shielding cities from the plague. In allegorical images, death rode as a horseman over entire towns. The danse macabre, born in the heart of the tragedy, remained a recurring image throughout the late Middle Ages and well into the Renaissance. As if art, unable to forget, needed to repeat the vision to avoid falling into the naivety of forgetfulness. Even in modern medicine, the Echo proved decisive. Although the theory of contagion would not be fully accepted until centuries later, practices born from the experience of the plague, such as isolation, street cleaning, the use of protective clothing, remained in medical manuals. And when new epidemics emerged, like cholera or the Spanish flu, institutional responses drew directly from that memory. Because the Black Death, in its horror, left behind an indelible lesson. The most fearsome enemy is not always visible, and time can become the enemy if action is not swift. Even today, when we speak of epidemics, pandemics, outbreaks, lockdowns, it is impossible not to hear that echo. In the 21st century, when the world faced global health crises, many of the images, decisions, and emotions were direct heirs of that distant plague. The urgency, the fear of contact, the desperate search for explanations, the need to begin again, all of that we had lived through before, in another century, with another plague, but under the same sun. The echo of the Black Death, then, is not merely a chapter of the past. It is a resonance that accompanies us, that reappears when we believe we have tamed chaos, that seeps into the cracks of human pride and reminds us that, no matter how far we've come, we are still vulnerable. But if that echo has endured so long, it is also because within it lies more than just fear. There is memory, there is learning, there is a kind of painful wisdom that transcends generations. It reminds us that history is not easily erased, that great traumas leave marks, not only in books or dates, but in the very way we inhabit the world. So when a city is designed with open squares, when a public health law is enacted, when a doctor studies isolation protocols, when an artist depicts death in a dance, there is the echo. There the plague still speaks. Not to frighten us, but to keep us from forgetting. And in that refusal to forget, perhaps, lies the deepest form of resistance. When death pays another visit, one would think that after a tragedy like the Black Death, humanity would have learned to recognize its footsteps, to decipher its signs, to build a solid shield against its possible return. But history, ever ironic, rarely follows the plans of reason. Because death did not leave, it only hid. And as the years passed, it returned with new faces, new masks, new names. The Black Death was not a one-time, unrepeatable event. It marked the beginning of an intermittent presence, a curse that would return to shake Europe from time to time, like an old spirit unwilling to be forgotten. After the great outbreak of the 14th century, just as the continent was beginning to recover, new flare-ups began to appear here and there, sometimes isolated, sometimes overwhelmingly strong. Death returned to Venice, Florence, London, Paris, without asking permission, with a chilling familiarity. And the most disturbing part was that the memory of the first plague helped little. Medicine remained powerless, faith oscillated between punishment and hope, and cities, though better prepared, were still vulnerable. By the 15th century, plague epidemics had become part of Europe's life cycle, like the seasons, like wars, like harvests. From time to time, a city would sound the alarm. Bells tolled, markets closed, families locked themselves indoors, beaked doctors reappeared in their black garments, and the deadly dance began once again. This repetition not only reinforced fear, it shaped a new kind of historical consciousness. The idea that the end of the world could be temporary, and yet would inevitably return. One of the most devastating resurgences occurred in 1605 in Milan. The city, which had already survived the collapse of the previous century, tried to enforce more aggressive preventive measures. Entire houses with a single detected case were sealed off. Entire neighborhoods were placed under armed watch. Food supply routes were established from outside the city, with no human contact. And still, the outbreak claimed tens of thousands of lives. The plague, no longer a surprise, still held the upper hand. London faced its own ordeal in 1665, in what history would call the Great Plague. It was the last major episode of bubonic plague in the English capital, and its impact was so profound that Parliament was suspended, and the aristocracy fled en masse. Chronicles speak of bodies piled up in the streets, of families buried in mass graves, of children left unclaimed. Decades later, Daniel Defoe would write a chilling account of that episode, almost like a witness's diary. For even with time, the wound did not heal. In Marseille, in 1720, the plague returned with a violence that stunned all of France. Despite medical advances, regulated trade, and quarantine systems at ports, the disease slipped through a crack and spread like fire. More than 100,000 people died in the city and its surroundings. Images of doctors with torches, of carts filled with corpses, of guards shooting those who broke quarantine, were as brutal as those from the early days of the original pandemic. Nothing had truly changed, or at least, not enough. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect was that with every return the plague found new cracks. Social distrust intensified. Blame was cast upon foreigners, the poor, beggars, merchants. Old accusations resurfaced, ancient hatreds were reignited, as though the disease not only attacked the body but also the very fabric of human cohesion. The plague became an excuse, a spark, a catalyst for all that was already close to erupting. And yet, amidst that tragic repetition, something different began to take root. Each epidemic left lessons, small but cumulative. Cities began to understand the importance of health surveillance. The first public health records were created, the first medical boards, the first urban sanitation policies as matters of state. Hospitals were founded with specific functions for epidemic care, and slowly, the approach shifted from theological to logistical. It became clear that while plague could not be entirely avoided, it could be contained. In parallel, science began to rise. The study of anatomy, driven by the urgency to understand the human body and its mysteries, intensified. Clinical observation began to replace philosophical treatises. Universities, once almost entirely devoted to scholasticism, began opening up to experimentation. It wasn't an immediate change, but it was irreversible. The plague, through its persistence, forced European thought to abandon the comfort of superstition and embrace, albeit cautiously, the methodical doubt. But the plague's constant return also left subtler marks. In the collective mindset, for example, a more tragic view of time took hold. People came to assume that stability was always provisional, that good years were, in fact, pauses between catastrophes. This idea shaped entire generations. Baroque art, heavy with symbols of death, skulls, hourglasses, wilting flowers, was a direct child of that awareness of an ever-looming end. Every painting, every poem, every mass carried a shadow. The plague never struck Europe again with the same ferocity it had in the 14th century, but its echo, its shadow, and its latent threat never fully disappeared. By the late 18th century, it was no longer bubonic plague that incited the greatest fear, but its descendants, its distant cousins, typhus, cholera, and later, influenza. Every new epidemic was viewed through the lens of the plague, as though history had taught us to always expect the worst. And perhaps that's why, when the modern world faced new pandemics, from the Spanish flu in 1918 to the public health crises of the 21st century, the figure of the Black Death resurfaced. In speeches, in the media, in inevitable comparisons. Because the plague, even in absence, remains the mold, the reference point, the original nightmare. So when death comes to visit again, it no longer arrives as a stranger. It returns as an old acquaintance, a figure we've seen before, one we've tried to forget, but who always comes back, even if in disguise. And that recognition, the knowledge that it has already been among us, that we have already faced it, that we have fallen but also risen, is what transforms memory into a form of defense. An imperfect defense, of course, but a defense nonetheless. The shadow that still breathes, even though the calendar tells us we have moved centuries beyond that time of ashes, even though our cities are lit by electric lights, crisscrossed by highways and monitored by satellites, even though science has opened more bodies than the Inquisition would have dared to imagine, there is still a presence breathing just behind our backs. It lingers in the basements of history, in the cracks of our mental architecture, in the way we react, tremble, or grow suspicious at the mere mention of an epidemic. The Black Death, that voracious entity that devastated Europe in the 14th century, never fully disappeared. It changed shape, dissolved into culture, mutated into a symbol, but it is still here, not as a disease, but as a wound, as a shadow that still breathes. It manifests, for example, in how we understand contagion, as if our instincts have known for centuries that bodies can be weapons without meaning to be. The plague taught humanity a primitive lesson, that touch can kill, that the air can betray, that a city can become a trap. And though modern pandemics go by different names and arise from different causes, the logic of their spread and the emotional responses they awaken in us stem from the same root, a medieval terror that never fully went away. That shadow also seeps into our visual culture. The images of beaked plague doctors, carts overflowing with corpses, skeletons dancing hand in hand with both peasants and nobles, all of it has become part of our collective unconscious. Even those unfamiliar with the historical details have seen some illustration, some film, some painting that echoes that era. The iconography of the Black Death has become timeless, as though it were a hidden language humanity refuses to leave behind. But that shadow breathes louder when the world begins to tremble. In moments when modern structures begin to creak, when technological certainty falters, when a new health crisis crosses borders, suddenly, in the news, on social media, in nervous comparisons, the name resurfaces. The Black Death. Not because it is the same, but because it is the measuring stick for everything that threatens to overwhelm us. It is the ultimate reference, the dark mirror. And that is no coincidence. The Black Death was the first time Europe, as a civilization, faced not a war, not an external invasion, but an invisible, relentless enemy that respected no hierarchy. Kings grew ill. Bishops died. Merchants collapsed aboard their own ships. No one was safe. And that awareness of absolute vulnerability left a deep mark on how the Western world sees itself. The plague destroyed more than bodies. It shattered the idea of control. And whatever destroys an idea leaves behind a scar. That's why, whenever we fear the return of the unthinkable, we look back. Not just to learn, but to remember how it hurt. Because something in us knows the past speaks in a low voice, and that history does not stay locked in books if its lessons haven't truly been understood. And if the Black Death left behind lessons still debated, it also left behind questions that remain unanswered. What does a society's response to disease reveal about its values? Who has access to healing, to care, to protection? Whose lives are deemed expendable when chaos descends? The plague of the 14th century showed us that, in the face of catastrophe, prejudice grows louder, fanaticism flourishes, and empathy erodes. Jews, women, foreigners, beggars, all were blamed. And in the hunt for the guilty other, we also learned that fear does not only kill with fever, but with hatred. That lesson, unfortunately, remains alive. We have seen in recent times how exclusionary rhetoric returns when illness becomes threat. We have witnessed how uncertainty breeds monsters, how the urge to find someone to blame can overwhelm the desire to save lives. And if that still happens today, in a world supposedly more rational, more informed, more just, then how much of that shadow do we still carry within? Yet not all of what the plague left behind is darkness. It also left traces of resilience, of reinvention. Humanity, wounded and half-broken, was able to create from the abyss. New forms of art emerged, new philosophical perspectives, religious reformations, political transformations. The church's absolute authority was questioned. A stronger bourgeoisie began to rise. Roads to the Renaissance opened, as if the plague, in its brutality, had cracked open spaces where light could enter. That dual legacy, trauma and rebirth, is what makes the shadow of the plague not only a threat, but also a seed, one that can grow in different directions. That is why it still breathes. Because it is not a flat shadow, but a living one, complex, ambiguous. Because it does not come to announce punishment, but to remind us that from collapse, something new can emerge. If we listen, if we do not repeat. And perhaps that is the ultimate reason this story keeps being told. Because even when we believe we live in a different era, safer, stronger, cleaner, that shadow remains close. Not as prophecy, but as mirror. A dark mirror that forces us to look within. To ask if we have truly changed. To ask what will happen when death comes knocking once again. Because yes, it will. History does not stop. And the plague, even if it no longer takes the shape of buboes or the stench of rotting flesh, will return in other forms, with other masks from other corners. And when it does, that echo that still lives within us, the same one born in the fields of Caffa, that crossed the ports of Genoa, that danced with the doctors of Paris, that howled in the streets of London, that echo will be the warning, and perhaps also the salvation. Because shadows do not disappear with time. They change shape. They learn to breathe more slowly. They adapt to our footsteps. And there is one that has never stopped doing so. And if this story has made you reflect, shiver, or simply look at the past with new eyes, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know which part resonated with you the most. Subscribe to keep exploring the darkest and most fascinating corners of history together, because there are many shadows that still breathe.